4. Before the subway incident, Odetta Walker had only been conscious a few times. These were like coral islands which look isolated to one above them, but are in fact only nodes in the spine of a long archipelago which is mostly underwater. Odetta suspected Detta not at all, and Detta had no idea that there was such a person as Odetta. But Detta at least had a clear understanding that something was wrong, that someone was fucking with her life. Odetta's imagination novelized all sorts of things which had happened when Detta was in charge of her body. Detta was not so clever. She thought she remembered things, some things at least, but all of the time she didn't. Detta was at least partially aware of the blanks. She could remember the china plate. She could remember that. She could remember slipping it into the pocket of her dress, looking over her shoulder all the while to make sure the blue woman wasn't there, peeking. She had to make sure because the china plate belonged to the blue woman. The china plate was, Detta understood in some vague way, a force special. Detta took it for that why. Detta remembered taking it to a place she knew, although she didn't know why she knew, as the drawers. A smoking trash-littered hole in the earth where she had once seen a burning baby with plastic skin. She remembered putting the plate carefully down on the gravelly ground and then starting to step on it and stomping, remembering taking off her plain cotton panties and putting them into the pocket where the plate had been, and then carefully slipping the first finger of her left hand carefully against the cut in her at the place where old stupid God had joined her and all other girl sandwomen imperfectly. But something about that place must be right, because she remembered the jolt, remembered wanting to press, remembered not pressing, remembered how delicious her vagina had been naked, without the cotton panties in the way of it and the world. And she had not pressed, not until her shoe pressed. Her black, patent leather shoe. Not until her shoe pressed down on the plate. Then she pressed on the cut with her finger, the way she was pressing on the blue woman's force special china plate with her foot. She remembered the way the black patent leather shoe covered the delicate blue webbing on the edge of the plate. She remembered the press, yes, she remembered pressing in the drawers, pressing with finger and foot, remembered the delicious promise of finger and cut, remembered that when the plate snapped with a bitter brittle snap, a similar brittle pleasure had skewered upward from the cut into her guts like an arrow. She remembered the cry which had broken from her lips, an unpleasant cawing like the sound of a crow scared up from a corn pitch. She could remember staring dully at the fragments of the plate, and then taking the plain white cotton panties slowly out of her dress pocket and putting them on again. Step-ins, so she had heard them called in some time and unhoused in memory, and drifting loose like turds on flood tide. Step-ins. Good, because first you stepped out to do your business, and then you stepped back in. First one shiny patent leather shoe, and then the other. Good. Panties were good. She could remember drawing them up her legs so clearly, drawing them past her knees, a scab on her left one almost ready to fall off and leave a clear pink new baby skin. Yes, she could remember so clearly it might not have been a week ago or yesterday, but only a single moment ago. She could remember how the waistband had reached the hem of her party dress, the clear contrast of white cotton against brown skin, like cream, yes, like that, cream from a pitcher caught suspended over coffee, the texture, the panties disappearing under the hem of the dress, except that the dress was burnt orange, and the panties were not going up but down, but they were still white, but not cotton, they were nylon. Cheap see-through nylon panties, cheap in more ways than one, and she remembered stepping out of them. She remembered how they glimmered on the floor mat of the 46 Dodge DeSoto. Yes, how white they were, how cheap they were. Not anything dignified like underwear, but cheap panties. The girl was cheap, and it was good to be cheap, good to be on sale, to be on the block, not even like a whore, but like a good breed so. She remembered no round china plate, but the round white face of a boy, some surprised drunk fraternity boy. He was no china plate, but his face was as round as the blue woman's china plate had been, and there was webbing on his cheeks, and this webbing looked as blue as the webbing on the blue woman's for special china plate had been. But there was only because the neon was red. The neon was garish. In the dark, the neon from the roadhouse sign made the spreading blood from the places on his cheeks where she had clawed him look blue. And he had said, "Why did you? Why did you? Why did you?" And then he unrolled the windows so he could get his face outside to puke. And she remembered hearing Dottie Stevens on the jukebox, singing about tan shoes with pink shoelaces, and a big Panama with a purple hat band. She remembered the sound of his puking was like gravel in a cement mixer, and his penis, which moments before had been a livid exclamation point rising from the tuft tangle of his pubic hair, was collapsing into a weak white question mark. She remembered the hoarse gravel sounds of his vomiting stopped and then started again, and she thought, "Well, I guess he made enough to lay this foundation yet," and laughing and pressing her finger, which now came equipped with a long, sharp nail, against her vagina, which was bare, but no longer bare because it was overgrown with its own coarse braided tangle, and there had been the same brittle breaking snap inside her, and it was still as much pain as it was pleasure, but better, far better, than nothing at all. And then he was grabbing blindly for her, and saying in a hurt-breaking tone, "Oh, you goddamn little cunt!" And she went on laughing just the same, dodging him easily, and snatching up her panties and opening the door on her side of a car, and feeling the last blind thud of his fingers on her back of her blouse, as she ran into a May night that was redolent of eerily honeysuckle, red-pink neon light shuttering off the gravel of some post-war parking lot, stuffing her panties, her cheap silk nylon panties, not into her pocket of her dress, but into a purse jumbled with a teenager's cheerful conglomeration of cosmetics. She was running, the light was shuttering, and then she was 23, and it was not panties but a rayon scarf, and she was casually slipping it into her purse as she walked along the counter in the nice notion section of Macy, a scarf which sold at the time for $1.99. Cheap. Cheap like the white nylon panties. Cheap. Like her. The body she inhabited was that of a woman who had inherited millions, but that was not known and didn't matter. The scarf was white, the edging blue, and there was the same little breaking sense of pleasure. She sat in the back seat of a taxi, and obvious the driver held the scarf in one hand, looking at her fixedly, while her other hand crept under her tweeted skirt and beneath the leg band of her white panties, and that one long dark finger took care of the business that needed to be taken care of in a single, merciless stroke. So sometimes she wandered, in a distracted sort of way, where she was when she wasn't here, but mostly her needs were too sudden and pressing for any extended contemplation, and she simply fulfilled what needed to be fulfilled, did what needed to be done. Roland would have understood. 5. Odetta could not have taken a limo everywhere, even in 1959. Although her father was still alive and she was not as fabulously rich as she would become when he died in 1962, the money held in trust for her had become hers on her 25th birthday, and she could do pretty much as she liked. But she cared very little for a phrase one of the conservative columnists had coined a year or two before. The phrase was limousine liberal, and she was young enough not to want to be seen as one, even if she really was one. Not young enough, or stupid enough, to believe that a few pairs of faded jeans and the khaki shirts she habitually wore in any real way changed her essential status, or riding the bus or the subway when she could have used the car. But she had been self-involved enough not to see Andrew's hurt and deep puzzlement. He liked her, and thought it must be some sort of personal rejection, but young enough to still believe that the gesture could sometimes overcome, or at least overset, truth. On the night of August 19th, 1959, she paid for the gesture with half her legs and half her mind. 6. Odetta had been first tugged, then pulled, and finally caught up in the swell which would eventually turn into a tidal wave. In 1957, she became involved in the things which eventually became known as the movement had no name. She knew some of the background, knew the struggle for equality had gone on not since the Emancipation Proclamation, but almost since the first boatload of slaves had been brought to America. To Georgia, in fact, but the colony the British founded to get rid of their criminals and debtors. But for Odetta it always seemed to begin in the same place, with the same three words. I'm not moving. The place had been a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and the words had been spoken by a black woman named Rosalie Parks. And the place from which Rosalie Parks was not moving was from the front of the city bus to the back of the city bus, which was, of course, the Jim Crow part of the city bus. Much later, Odetta would sing, "We Shall Not Be Moved," with the rest of them, and it always made her think of Rosalie Parks, and she never sang it without a sense of shame. It was so easy to sing "we" with your arms linked to the arms of a whole crowd. That was easy for a woman with no legs. So easy to sing "we," so easy to be "we." There had been no "we" on that bus. That bus must have stank of ancient leather and years of cigar and cigarette smoke. That bus with the curved ad cards saying things like "Lucky Strike LSMFT" and "Attend the church of your choice for heaven's sake," and "Drink Ovaltine, you'll see what we mean," and "Chesterfield, 21 great tobaccos makes 20 wonderful smokes." No, we, under the disbelieving gazes of motormen, the white passengers among whom she sat, the equally disbelieving stares of the blacks at the back. No we. No marching thousands. Only Rosalie Parks, starting the tidal wave with 3 words, "I'm not moving." Odetta would think, if I could do something like that, if I could be that brave, I think I could be happy for the rest of my life. But that sort of courage is not in me. She had read of the Parks incident, but with little interest at first. That came little by little. It was hard to say exactly when or how her imagination had been caught and fired by that first almost soundless racequake which had begun to shake to the south. A year or so later, a young man she was dating more or less regularly began taking her down to the village, where some of the young, and mostly white, folk singers who performed there had added some new startling songs to their repertoire. Suddenly, in addition to all those old wheezes about John Henry had taken his hammer and outraced a new steam hammer, killing himself in the process, Lord Lord, and how Barbary Allen had cruelly rejected her lovesick young suitor and ended up dying of shame, Lord Lord. There were songs about how it felt to be down and out and ignored in the city, how it felt to be turned away from a job you could do because your skin was the wrong color, how it felt to be taken into a jail cell and whipped by Mr. Charlie because your skin was dark and you had dared, Lord, to sit in the white folks section of the lunch counter at the F.W. Woolworths in Montgomery, Alabama. Absurdly or not, it was only then that she had become curious about her own parents, and their parents before them. She would never read Roots. She was in another world and the time long before that book was written, perhaps even thought of by Alex Haley, but it was at this absurdly late time in her life when it first dawned upon her that not so many generations back her progenitors had been taken in chains by white men. Surely the fact had occurred to her before, but only as a piece of information with no real temperature gradient, like an equation, never as something which bore immediately upon her own life. Odetta totted up what she knew, and was appalled by the smallness of the sum. She knew her mother had been born in Odetta, Arkansas, the town for which she, the only child, had been named. She knew her father had been a small-town dentist who had invented and patented a capping process which had lain dormant and unremarked for 10 years and which had then, suddenly, made him a moderately wealthy man. She knew that he had developed a number of other dental procedures during the 10 years before and the 4 years after the influx of wealth, most of them either orthodontic or cosmetic in nature, and that, shortly after moving to New York with his wife and daughter, who had been born 4 years after the original patent had been secured, he had founded a company called Holmes Dental Industries, which was now to teeth what squib was to antibiotics. But when she asked him what life had been during all the years between, the years when she hadn't been there, and the years when she had, her father wouldn't tell her, he would say all sorts of things, but he wouldn't tell her anything. He closed that part of himself off to her. Once her ma, Alice, he called her Ma or sometimes Allie if he had a few more or was feeling good, said, "Tell her about the time those men shot you and when you drove the Ford through the covered bridge, Dan." And he gave Odetta's ma such a gray and foreboding look that her ma, always something of a sparrow, had shrunk back into her seat and said no more. Odetta had tried her mother once or twice alone after that night, but to no avail. If she had tried before, she might have gotten something, but because he wouldn't speak, she wouldn't speak either, and to him, she realized, the past, those relatives, those red dirt roads, those stores, those dirt floor cabins with glass windows, ungraced by a single simple courtesy of a curtain, those incidents of hurt and harassment, those neighbors' children who went dressed in smocks which had begun life as flour sacks, all of that was for him buried away like dead teeth beneath a perfect blinding white caps. He would not speak, perhaps could not, had perhaps willingly afflicted himself a selective amnesia. The capped teeth was their life in Graymerle apartments in Central Park South. All else was hidden beneath this impervious outer cover. His past was so well protected that there had been no gap to slide through, no way to pass the perfect cap barrier into the throat of the revelation. Detta knew things, but Detta didn't know Odetta, and Odetta didn't know Detta. So the teeth lay as smooth and closed as a Redan gate there also. She had some of her mother's shyness in her as well as her father's unblinking, if unspoken, toughness. And the only time she had dared pursue him further on the subject, to suggest that what he was denying her was a deserved thrust fund never promised and apparently never to mature, had been one night in his library. He had shaken his Wall Street Journal carefully, closed it, folded it, and laid it aside on the deal table beside the standing lamp. He had removed his rimmed steel spectacles and had laid them on top of the paper. Then he had looked at her, a thin black man, thin almost to the point of emaciation, tightly knitted gray hair now drawing rapidly away from the deepening hollows of his temples where tender clock springs of veins pulsed steadily, and he had said only, "I don't want to talk about that part of my life, Odetta, or think about it. It would be pointless. The world has moved on since then." Roland would have understood. Thank you for sitting down with another part of Majin reading Drawing of the Three. We are slowly diving into the mentality of the two personalities of Detta and Odetta, the same person really, but very different. Apparently we can see that Odetta is a normal person overall, trapped in the era of racism in America. She is part of the civil rights movement, a political activist, and a pretty wealthy woman and well-adjusted woman. Detta, on the other hand, is poor, spiteful, violent, and a little bit sadomasochistic. It will be strange to see what happens when these two finally meet each other, or when Roland and Eddie, who I suspect we will soon meet again, will meet the two ladies. Long days and pleasant nights, listener.